You chose the wrong man to save. The words didn't make sense at first, not with the rain hitting my face and my heart beating so loud I could barely hear anything else. Not with the cold press of something steady against my skin and the man in front of me looking like he had already decided how this night would end. But 48 hours earlier, none of this existed. It was just me, a 12-hour shift behind me, my feet aching in worn-out sneakers, and the city slick with rain under streetlights that buzzed like they were. Tired too. I remember pulling my jacket tighter as the wind cut through it and thinking about nothing more than getting home, heating up leftovers, maybe falling asleep on the couch before midnight. And then I saw him, an old man crumpled near the curb like something the city had forgotten, his coat too thin for the weather, his hand shaking just enough to catch my attention. I should have kept walking. People always say that later, that you should mind your business, that kindness can cost more than you can afford. But I stopped. I always stop. I knelt beside him, asked if he was okay, and his eyes found mine. Sharp, too sharp for someone who looked that fragile, like he was measuring me, deciding something I didn't understand. You shouldn't be here, he whispered, his voice rough but steady, and I almost laughed because neither should he. Not in this cold, not alone, not like this. So I helped him up, felt how light he was, how carefully he moved, like every step mattered. I brought him back to my place, a small apartment that barely held me most days, and sat him down on my couch while the heater rattled like it might give up any second. I cleaned a cut on his hand, nothing serious, but he watched me the entire time like I was doing something more than just helping, like I had stepped into a story I didn't know existed. You don't ask questions, he said quietly, and I shrugged. Told him I didn't need answers to do the right thing, but something in his expression shifted, not softer, not exactly, just different. Like he hadn't expected that, like maybe no one had said that to him in a long time. I thought that was the end of it, just a strange night, a stranger I helped, a story I'd forget by morning. But as I stood there now, staring at the man in front of me, the one who carried silence like power and looked at me like I was standing in the way of something inevitable, I realized I hadn't just helped a stranger, I had stepped directly between two worlds. And I had no idea which one was about to close, and first I did not step aside, not because I was brave, but because something inside me refused to move, and the man in front of me noticed it immediately, his gaze dropping for a second to where my hands trembled at my sides before returning to my face like he was trying to understand why I was still there. You do not belong here, he said quietly, and somehow that felt more dangerous than if he had raised his voice, because it sounded like a fact. Like a rule I had already broken. Behind me, I could feel the old man shift slightly on the couch, his breath uneven but controlled. And that was when I realized something that made my stomach tighten. He was not afraid the way I was. Not really. He was waiting, as if this moment had been coming for a long time, and I had simply walked into the middle of it without knowing. She has nothing to do with this, the old man said, his voice clearer now, stronger than it had been the night I found him. And the change was impossible to ignore. It was like watching someone step out of a disguise. The man in front of me, Adrian, tilted his head just slightly, studying him, then me again. And for a second the room felt smaller, like the air itself was deciding who it belonged to. Everyone has something to do with this, Adrian replied, his tone calm, controlled, but carrying a weight that made my chest feel tight. I shook my head before I could stop myself, the words coming out faster than I had planned, telling him I did not know anything, that I had just helped someone who needed it, that this was a mistake. But he did not interrupt, he just listened, and that somehow made it worse, because when I finished there was no reaction, no anger, no dismissal, just that same steady gaze, like he was deciding what I was worth in a situation I still did not understand. You took him in, he said after a moment, and it was not a question. I nodded slowly, because denying it felt pointless. Because the truth was the only thing I had, and even that felt fragile now. You fed him, treated him, gave him a place to stay, he continued, each word measured, like he was building something piece by piece. I swallowed, the memory of those quiet hours in my apartment flashing through my mind. The way the old man had watched the window instead of the television. The way he had asked me strange questions about whether I lived alone, whether anyone checked on me. Things that had felt odd at the time, but not enough to make me stop helping. Yes, I said finally, and for the first time Adrian's expression shifted, not softer, not kinder, But something changed, like a line had been crossed. Then you made a choice, he said, and his eyes held mine in a way that made it impossible to look away. And choices have consequences. The room went quiet after that, the kind of silence that presses in from all sides. And I realized then that whatever happened next was no longer just about the man I had helped. It was about me, about the moment I had stopped on a rain-soaked street and decided not to walk away, and as Adrian took one slow step closer, closing the distance just enough to make my breath catch, I understood something that felt both terrifying and strangely certain. This was not the end of the story I had stepped into. It was only the beginning. I felt the space between us shrink even though no one else moved, like the room itself had shifted its attention to that single step he had taken, and I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for something I could not name. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice quieter than I expected, but steady enough that it did not betray how fast. My thoughts were racing, because none of this made sense. I had done one simple thing, one small act of kindness, and somehow it had turned into this moment where every word mattered. Adrian studied me again, slower this time, like he was looking past what I said and searching for something underneath it, something I had not said out loud, and that made my chest tighten more than anything else, because it felt like he could see things I did not even understand about myself yet. "I want to know why," he said finally, and that confused me more than anything, because I had expected anger, or orders, or something cold and final, but not that, not a question. That sounded almost human. "Why what?" I asked, and for a second his gaze shifted, not away, but deeper, like he was choosing how much to reveal. "Why you stopped," he said. "Why you brought him home, why you stayed." The questions hung in the air between us, simple on the surface but carrying something heavier underneath, and I did not have a complicated answer, not one that matched the weight of this moment. So I told him the truth, because no one else did. I said, and the words felt small, compared to everything else in the room, but they were the only ones I had. Behind me, I heard the faintest exhale, like the old man had been holding his breath too, and when I glanced back at him for a second his eyes were on Adrian, not afraid, not pleading, just watching, like he was waiting to see what kind of man stood in front of me now. When I looked back, Adrian's expression had changed again, not softer, not warmer, but something had shifted, like the answer I gave had not fit into whatever expectation he had. "You think that is enough," he said quietly, and it was not mocking, it was not cruel, it was something else, something closer to disbelief. I shook my head slowly, because I did not know what was enough in his world. I barely understood the edges of it. "It was enough for me," I said, and the words settled into the silence that followed, heavy in a different way now, like they had drawn a line that neither of us had expected. Adrian's eyes held mine for a long moment, and then something happened that I could not explain, something subtle but unmistakable. The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly, like a decision had been made somewhere inside him that he was not going to say out loud. He turned his head just enough to signal the men behind him without looking at them, and the shift in the room was immediate, quieter, less sharp, like the edge had been pulled back just enough to let the air move again. But when he looked back at me, that intensity was still there, focused now in a way that felt even more dangerous, because it was no longer about the man behind me. It was about me. "You made a choice," he repeated, but this time it sounded different, less like a warning and more like a recognition. And as he stepped back just enough to give me space instead of taking it, I realized something that made my heart beat even faster than before. I had not just stepped into his world. Somehow, without meaning to, I had changed something inside it. And I had no idea what that was going to cost me next. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt like something waiting. And I realized I was still standing exactly where I had been when he stepped toward me. Like moving now would change something I could not undo. Adrian's presence shifted again, not retreating, not advancing, just settling, like he had decided this moment was no longer about control, but about understanding, and that made everything more complicated, not less, because I did not know how to respond to that kind of attention. "You should not have brought him here," he said after a while, his voice quieter now, not directed at the room, but at me alone. And for the first time it did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a statement of fact, something that existed whether I accepted it or not. I glanced back at the old man, at Leonard, though I had only learned his name hours after he arrived. Spoken softly like it carried weight. He was sitting straighter now, the weakness from before almost gone, replaced by something steadier. Something that matched the tension in the room in a way that made me realize just how much he had been hiding. I did not know, I said, turning back to Adrian, because that was still the truth, the only truth I could hold on to. No, Adrian replied, and there was no accusation in it. Just acknowledgement, like he believed me completely, and somehow that felt heavier than doubt would have, because it meant this was not about mistakes, it was about consequences. He took another slow step, not closer to me this time, but past me, his attention shifting briefly to Leonard, and the air changed again, not sharper, not colder, just more focused. Like two stories that had been running separately were finally meeting in the same place. I could feel it without understanding it, the weight of something unfinished hanging between them. But Adrian did not speak to him. Not yet. Instead, he turned slightly, enough that I was still in his line of sight, still part of whatever decision he was making. You live here alone, he said. And it was not a question. My chest tightened at how easily he said it, how naturally he knew. And I nodded before I could stop myself, because denying it felt pointless again, because everything about him suggested he already knew the answers before. Asking, "You work late," he continued, his eyes flicking briefly to the small details in the room. The worn couch, the stack of unopened mail, the faint hum of the refrigerator that had seen better years, things I had stopped noticing because they were just my life, but under his gaze they felt exposed, like pieces of a puzzle I had not realized I was showing. "Yes," I said quietly, and he exhaled slowly, not tired, not frustrated, just thoughtful, like he was placing those details into something larger, something I could not see yet. "Then you understand risk," he said, and I almost laughed at that, because I did not. Not like he did, not like whatever world he came from demanded. But before I could answer, Leonard spoke again, his voice steady now, stronger than before. "Leave her out of this," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no weakness, just certainty. Adrian's gaze shifted fully to him then, and for a second I felt like I was no longer the center of the room, like the gravity had changed direction. But then Adrian looked back at me, and something in his expression made my breath catch. Not because it was soft, not because it was kind, but because it was deliberate, like he had reached a conclusion I was not ready to hear. "She is already part of this," he said, and the way he said it made it feel final, like a door closing somewhere behind me. And as the weight of those words settled in, I understood something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. I had thought helping someone was a single moment, a choice you make and move on from. But standing there now, with both of them watching me in different ways, I realized some choices do not end. They expand. They grow into something you cannot step away from. And whatever this was becoming, it had already begun to wrap around me in ways I could no longer ignore. The words settled heavier than anything else that had been said, not loud, not sharp, just final. And I felt it in the way my chest tightened, like something invisible had just closed around me. "Already part of this," I repeated under my breath, not really asking, not really arguing, just trying to understand how something so simple had turned into something I could not step out of. Adrian did not correct me, did not explain. He simply watched me like he was waiting for me to catch up to a reality he had already accepted, and that made something inside me push back, not loudly, not recklessly, but firmly enough that I found myself lifting my chin just a little. "I helped someone," I said, my voice steadier now. "That is all I did." And for a second I thought that might matter, that maybe in his world there was still room for something that simple, but the look in his eyes told me it was not that easy, not here, not with him. "You helped the wrong person," he replied, and the words were quiet, almost gentle, but they carried more weight than anything else, because they did not dismiss what I had done. They redefined it, turned it into something else entirely, something dangerous in a way I was only beginning to understand. Behind me, Leonard shifted again, and I could feel the tension in the room stretch thinner, like something was about to snap or settle. I could not tell which. "She did not know," Leonard said, and this time there was something else in his voice, not just certainty, but something close to regret, and that was the first time I felt a flicker of something I had not allowed myself to feel before. Doubt. not about helping him, but about what I had stepped into without asking. Adrian's gaze flickered to him again, briefly, then back to me, and I noticed it then. The smallest change in the way he stood, less rigid, less like he needed to control every inch of the space around him. Like something about this situation had shifted his usual rules. No, Adrian said, agreeing again. She did not. And for a moment the room held that truth between all of us, simple and complicated at the same time. But then he took a slow breath, and I knew it was not over, not even close. But now you do, he added. And that was the part that landed differently, because it meant whatever came next would not be about ignorance anymore. It would be about choice, my choice, and I felt that realization settle into me like something solid, something I could not ignore or soften. I looked at Leonard, really looked at him this time. At the way he held himself, at the sharpness still in his eyes despite everything, at the quiet strength that did not match the image of a helpless man I had first seen, and I understood then that he had never been what I thought he was, not entirely. And maybe that was not his fault. Maybe it was mine for assuming, for choosing to see only what I wanted to see. When I looked back at Adrian, he was still watching me. But now there was something else there, something measured, like he was waiting to see what I would do with the truth he had just handed me. And I realized this was the moment that mattered more than anything else. Not the past 2 days, not the rain, not the chance encounter, but this quiet space where I could either step back or stay where I was. And my voice surprised me when I finally spoke. Not loud, not defiant, just clear. Then tell me what happens next, I said. Because if I was already part of this, if there was no stepping back to the version of my life that existed before that night, then I needed to understand what I was standing inside. Adrian held my gaze for a long second, and then something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression. Not approval, not relief, but recognition, like I had just crossed another line he had been waiting for. That depends, he said slowly, on whether you are still the kind of person who stops in the rain. And the question lingered there, heavier than any answer I could give, because for the first time since all of this began, I understood what was really being asked, not what I had done, but who I was willing to be now that I knew. The cost the question did not feel like a question. It felt like a line drawn somewhere I could not see, and I stood there trying to understand why my answer mattered so much to him, to this moment, to whatever came next, because part of me wanted to say no, to step back, to pretend I had learned my lesson and would not make the same mistake twice. But the truth sat heavier than that, quieter, harder to ignore. I had already answered that question the night I stopped in the rain, and nothing about what I had learned since then had changed who I was in that moment. I did not stop because it was safe. I said slowly, my voice steady but softer now. I stopped because it felt right. And the words hung between us, simple but not weak. Not anymore. Adrian watched me like he was measuring something deeper than the sentence itself, like he was listening for what it meant beyond the surface. And for a second, I thought he might argue, might tell me that right and wrong did not work the same way in his world. But he did not. He just exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the hum of the room. That is the problem, he said, not unkindly. And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, because it did not sound like criticism. It sounded like recognition, like he had seen this before and knew where it led. Behind me, Leonard shifted again, and this time I felt it differently, not as tension, but as awareness, like he was watching this exchange with a kind of quiet understanding that I was only beginning to catch up to. She should leave, Leonard said, his voice lower now, more certain, and for the first time there was something else in it, not just concern, but acceptance, like he already knew how this would end if I stayed. Adrian's gaze flicked to him, sharper for a moment, then softened again in that controlled way that never fully revealed anything. If she leaves now, Adrian replied, she leaves knowing enough to matter. And that sentence landed harder than anything else, because it meant there was no clean exit anymore. No simple way back to the life I had before, not without carrying this with me. And I felt that truth settle into my bones in a way that made my next breath feel heavier, slower. I looked around my apartment, at the small details that had always felt safe, familiar, mine, and suddenly they looked different, like they belonged to a version of me that had already shifted, that had already stepped too far to pretend none of this was real. When I looked back at Adrian, he was still watching me, but now there was something else there, Something quieter, less like control, and more like patience. And that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant he was not forcing this. He was waiting for me to choose. So what are my options? I asked, and this time my voice did not shake at all, not because I was not afraid, but because I understood that fear was not going to change anything now. Adrian tilted his head slightly, considering me in that same deliberate way, and then he spoke, each word measured, clear. You can walk away, he said, and for a second, my heart lifted, just enough to feel it. But then he continued, and spend the rest of your life wondering who is watching you because of what you know. And the lift disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by something colder, something more real. Or, he added, his gaze holding mine in a way that made it impossible to look anywhere else. You can stay, and I make sure no one touches what you chose to protect. The room went still again after that, but it felt different this time, less like pressure and more like a decision waiting to be made. And I realized that this was not about him anymore. Not really. It was about me, about whether I was willing to accept that my life had changed. The moment I chose to help someone I did not understand, and as I stood there, caught between the version of myself I had always known and the one I was becoming, I understood something that made my next words inevitable. Even before I spoke them, some choices are not about what you want. They are about who you already are, and whether you are ready to live with that truth once it stops being simple. I did not answer right away because for the first time since all of this began, I understood that whatever I said next would not just shape this moment, it would shape everything after it. And that realization slowed everything down, made the room feel sharper, clearer, like every detail mattered in a way it had not before. I looked at Adrian, really looked at him, at the way he stood without needing to prove anything, at the quiet control in his voice, at the way he did not rush me even though it was obvious he could. And something about that unsettled me more than if he had forced the decision, because it meant this was real, this was mine to choose. If I stay, I said carefully, feeling each word before I let it out. Nothing goes back to the way it was, does it? Adrian did not hesitate, did not soften it. No, he said. And the honesty of it landed harder than anything else, because it left no space for illusions, no space to pretend this was temporary. Behind me, I felt Leonard's presence shift again, and when I glanced at him, there was something in his expression I had not seen before, not fear, not urgency, but something quieter, something that looked like understanding mixed with regret, like he had seen this path before and knew where it led. You do not owe me anything, he said, his voice steady but softer now, and that made something inside me tighten, because I knew he meant it, knew he would accept it if I walked away, but that did not make it easier, it made it harder, because it meant staying would truly be my choice, not something I was pushed into. I turned back to Adrian, and he was still watching me with that same measured focus, not impatient, not demanding, just waiting, and I realized then that he had already given me everything I needed to decide, not comfort, not reassurance, but clarity, the kind that does not leave room for excuses. I thought about the life I had before this, about the routine that felt small but safe, about the way I used to believe that doing the right thing was simple, that it would always lead somewhere good, and I felt that version of myself shift, not disappear, but change, like it had been tested and come out different on the other side. If I leave, I said, slowly, I spend every day looking over my shoulder. Adrian gave a slight nod, confirming it without words. And if I stay, I continued, my voice quieter now but stronger, I step into something I do not understand. Another pause, another steady look, another silent confirmation, and for a moment I closed my eyes, just long enough to feel the weight of both choices settle into me, just long enough to realize that neither one was easy, neither one was safe, but only one of them felt honest to who I had already proven myself to be. When I opened my eyes again, I did not look at Leonard, I did not look at the room, I looked at Adrian, because this decision existed between the two of us now, and I felt something inside me settle, not calm, not fearless, just certain. Then I stay, I said, and the words felt heavier than anything I had said all night, but also clearer, like they had been waiting for me to catch up to them. The silence that followed was different, not tense, not uncertain, just still, like something had clicked into place. Adrian held my gaze for a long second, And then something shifted in his expression again, subtle but unmistakable, like he had expected resistance and found something else instead, something that did not fit into the rules he was used to. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried something deeper underneath it. "Then you do not leave my side," he said, not as a command, not entirely, but as a condition that felt just as binding. And as the weight of that settled in, I realized this was not protection in the way I understood it. It was something else, something closer, something more permanent. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood that staying was not just a choice. It was a commitment to a world that had already started to change me in ways I could not undo. The condition did not sound optional, even though he had not raised his voice, and I felt it settle around me like something unseen but solid. "You do not leave my side," I repeated quietly, not challenging it, just understanding what it meant, because it was not about distance, it was about control, about stepping into a world where my choices would no longer be entirely my own. Adrian did not correct me, did not soften it. He simply held my gaze like he was making sure I understood before anything else moved forward. And I realized then that this was his version of protection, not gentle, not comforting, but absolute. "Then what about him?" I asked, glancing back at Leonard, because even though everything had shifted, that part of me had not, the part that had stopped in the rain, the part that had decided he mattered. Adrian's expression changed slightly, just enough to show that this question was expected, not inconvenient. He turned his attention fully to Leonard now, and the air in the room adjusted again, like something deeper had been brought to the surface. "He made his choices long before tonight," Adrian said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying something older underneath it, something that did not belong to this room alone. Leonard met his gaze without hesitation, and for the first time since this began, I saw it clearly. Not fear, not weakness, but history, something unspoken but heavy between them. "And so did you," Leonard replied, and the quiet certainty in his voice made something shift again, like the balance between them was not as simple as I had first thought. I stood there between them, feeling that weight without fully understanding it, and it made everything more complicated, because this was not just about right and wrong anymore. It was about past and present colliding in a way I could not untangle. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he was considering something deeper than the words themselves. And then he looked back at me, and that shift was immediate, like he was stepping out of one world and back into another. "You chose to protect him," he said, and this time there was no question in it, just acknowledgement. "So I will not take that from you." The words surprised me more than anything else that had happened, not because they were kind, but because they were deliberate, like he was adjusting something in his own rules to account for me. And I felt that realization settle into me in a way that made my breath catch, because it meant my choice had not just affected me, it had affected him, even if he would never say it out loud. "But he does not stay here," Adrian continued, and the firmness returned, not harsh, but absolute. "Not in a place that cannot be secured." I understood that word even without asking. Secured. It meant control. It meant oversight. It meant stepping further into his world whether I was ready or not. I looked at Leonard, expecting resistance, expecting refusal, but instead he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like he had already accepted this outcome long before I had caught up to it. "It is safer," he said quietly, and there was no argument in his voice, just truth, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant this situation was bigger than I had imagined, deeper than a single decision or a single night. When I looked back at Adrian, he was watching me again, not waiting this time, but confirming, like he needed to see that I understood the next step before taking it. And I felt that same weight settle into me again, the understanding that every moment forward would be shaped by this choice, by this world I had stepped into. "Where do we go?" I asked, and my voice did not shake, not because I was not afraid, but because I had already accepted that fear was part of this now. Adrian held my gaze for a second, then turned slightly, signaling something I could not see but could feel, like the next phase had already begun the moment I said I would stay. "Somewhere you can be protected," he said, and as those words settled in, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. This was no longer about one decision. It was about everything that would come after it, and whether I was ready to live inside the consequences. Of being the kind of person who stops in the rain, even when the storm does not end. The decision moved faster than I expected after that. Not rushed, not chaotic, just inevitable, like everything had already been set in motion the moment I said I would stay. Adrian stepped back slightly, and the space he created did not feel like distance. It felt like direction, like he was guiding what happened next without needing to explain it. "Get what you need," he said, his voice calm, but carrying that same quiet authority. And for a second, I just stood there, looking around my apartment like I was seeing it for the first time. The small kitchen with the flickering light above the sink, the worn couch where Leonard had been resting, the stack of bills I had been avoiding on the counter, all of it suddenly felt temporary, like it belonged to a version of my life that was already fading. I moved slowly at first, grabbing my jacket, my bag, things that felt important but suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what I was stepping into. And that realization followed me with every step, that none of this was really about what I could carry with me. It was about what I was leaving behind. When I turned back, Leonard was already on his feet, steadier than before, his posture straight in a way that made it clear the weakness I had seen was only part of the truth. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly, and I knew he meant it. Knew he would not blame me if I walked away. Even now, but something inside me had already settled, something that did not shift anymore with doubt. "I already did," I replied, and the simplicity of it surprised even me, because it was true. The moment I helped him, the moment I chose not to walk away, everything after that had been building toward this. Adrian watched that exchange without interrupting, his expression unreadable but focused, like he was taking in more than just the words. And when I stepped closer, ready without fully knowing what that meant, he gave a slight nod, not approval, not encouragement, just acknowledgement, like I had crossed another threshold he had been expecting. The hallway outside felt different when we stepped into it, quieter, heavier, like the world beyond my apartment had already adjusted to this shift. I could hear the faint hum of the city through the walls, distant traffic, a siren far away, normal sounds that suddenly felt disconnected from everything happening here. As we moved toward the exit, I felt Adrian's presence beside me, not touching, not guiding physically, but close enough that I was aware of him with every step, like an anchor I had not chosen but now depended on. When we reached the door, I hesitated for just a second, my hand resting on the handle as I looked back one last time, at the space that had been mine, that had been safe in its own small way, and I felt something shift again, not regret, not exactly, but awareness, that I was stepping into something that would not let me return the same. "You can still walk away," Adrian said quietly behind me, and the fact that he said it again, even now, made it feel more real, more final. I did not turn around when I answered, because I did not need to see his expression to know what this meant. "No," I said, and this time there was no hesitation at all. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, and the moment I did, something inside me settled in a way I could not explain, like a choice had finally aligned with the path it was meant to take. As the door closed behind us, the sound soft but definitive, I realized something that stayed with me even as we moved forward into whatever waited next. I had not just left a place, I had left a version of myself behind, and there was no going back to it now. Not after choosing to follow a man who made the world feel smaller and more dangerous just by standing in it. And as we walked toward the unknown, I understood that whatever came next would not be about whether I was ready. It would be about whether I could become the person this choice required me to be. The night air felt colder than it had earlier, sharper against my skin, like it was trying to remind me that everything outside my apartment was still real, still unchanged. Even though nothing inside me felt the same anymore, I stepped out onto the sidewalk, and for a second I just stood there, the city stretching around us in quiet movement, headlights passing, distant voices, the normal rhythm of a world that had no idea mine had just shifted completely. Adrian moved ahead slightly, not leaving me behind, but not waiting either, like he expected me to follow without being told. And I did, my steps falling into pace beside his before I even realized I had made the decision again. His presence felt different out here, less contained, more defined, like the city itself adjusted to him instead of the other way around. A black car waited at the curb, engine running, its presence subtle but deliberate, and as we approached it, the driver stepped out immediately, opening the door without a word, without needing instruction, the kind of movement that spoke of routine, of a world where everything was already understood before it was said. I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, my hand brushing against the cool surface of the car door, because stepping inside felt like crossing another line, one I would not be able to step back from as easily. Adrian noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. "This is the part where you decide again," he said quietly, not looking at me directly, but aware of me in a way that made it impossible to pretend otherwise. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of that truth settle in again, because he was right. Every step forward was another choice, another confirmation of what I had already started, and I realized something then, something simple but undeniable. I had already chosen, not once, not twice, but every time I refused to step away when I could have. So I got into the car, the interior warm and quiet, the door closing behind me with a soft finality that echoed louder than it should have. Adrian followed without hesitation, taking the seat beside me like it was the only place he ever occupied. And the moment the door shut, the car pulled away smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic without drawing attention. I looked out the window as the city moved past us, familiar streets turning unfamiliar with every passing second, the small details of my usual route fading into something I no longer recognized. And I felt it again, that shift inside me, not fear exactly, but awareness that I was no longer just observing this world. I was inside it now, part of it in a way that did not have an easy exit. "Where are we going?" I asked quietly, not because I expected a clear answer, but because I needed to hear something, anything that grounded this moment in something real. Adrian did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed ahead, thoughtful in a way that made it seem like the question had more layers than I understood. "Somewhere quiet," he said finally. "Somewhere controlled." And I knew what that meant without needing more explanation. It meant a place where nothing happened unless he allowed it, where the unpredictability I had lived with my whole life did not exist in the same way. And that realization both steadied me and unsettled me at the same time. I shifted slightly in my seat, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag, and that was when I felt it, subtle but unmistakable, Adrian's hand resting briefly over mine, not gripping, not holding, just there. A quiet contact that felt more deliberate than anything else he had done. I looked at him, surprised, but his gaze remained forward, his expression unchanged, like that small gesture was not something he needed to explain, and yet it said more than any words could have. Not comfort, not softness, but assurance, like he was anchoring me to something solid in the middle of everything uncertain. "You made your choice," he said after a moment, his voice low, steady, and I felt the words settle into me in a way that made my heartbeat slow just slightly. Not because they removed the unknown, but because they acknowledged it, because they recognized that I had stepped into this willingly, even if I did not fully understand it yet. And as the city lights blurred past the window and the road ahead stretched into something I could not see the end of, I realized something that stayed with me in the quiet of that moving car. I was not just being taken somewhere. I was being brought into something that would test every version of who I thought I was. And whether I could hold on to that person or become someone else entirely was no longer a question for later. It had already begun. The car did not stop for a long time. Or maybe it only felt that way because every second stretched differently now, measured not by distance but by what I was leaving behind and what I was moving toward. The city outside the window slowly changed, the crowded streets giving way to quieter blocks, then wider roads, then something that felt more distant from everything I knew. And I realized I had stopped recognizing where we were a while ago, which should have scared me more than it did. But instead, there was a strange calm settling in, not comfort, not trust, but acceptance, like my mind had finally caught up to the fact that control was no longer mine in the way it used to be. Beside me, Adrian remained still, his presence steady, not intrusive, not distant, just there in a way that made the silence feel intentional rather than empty. His hand had moved away at some point, but the memory of that brief contact stayed, grounding me in a way I had not expected. "You are quiet," he said after a while, his voice low, not questioning, just observing. I turned my head slightly to look at him, taking in the calm precision of his expression, The way nothing about him seemed rushed or uncertain, and I realized that this was normal for him. This movement, this shift, this control over where things went next. I am thinking, I replied, because it was the simplest truth I had, and he nodded slightly, like that was enough. Like he did not need more from me right now. The car slowed gradually, the change almost unnoticeable at first until the surroundings became clearer. A gated entrance ahead, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of place that did not invite attention but ensured privacy. The gates opened before we fully stopped, and that alone told me more than anything else could have. This was not somewhere you arrived unexpectedly. This was somewhere you were expected. The car moved through without pause, the outside world slipping away behind us as if it had never been part of this moment at all. I felt it then, more clearly than before. The shift from public to private, from unpredictable to controlled, and it made everything feel sharper, more defined, like I had stepped into a space where nothing happened without intention. When the car finally came to a stop, I did not move right away, my eyes taking in what I could see through the window. A large structure ahead, not ostentatious, not overwhelming, but solid in a way that suggested permanence, like it had been built to last, and to keep things exactly as they were meant to be. The door opened from the outside, the same quiet efficiency as before, and Adrian stepped out first, not rushing, not waiting, simply continuing forward as if the path had already been set. I followed a second later, the cool night air meeting me again, but feeling different here, quieter, less chaotic, like even the sound of the city had been filtered out. I stood there for a moment, taking it in, the stillness, the structure, the sense that this place operated on rules I did not yet understand. Adrian turned back slightly, just enough to make sure I was with him, and there was something in that glance that felt different from before, not just awareness, but expectation, like he had brought me here for a reason that had not yet been explained. "This is where you stay," he said, his voice calm, certain, and the words settled into me with a weight that felt both grounding and overwhelming. Because this was no longer temporary, not in the way I had been thinking. This was a step deeper, a commitment to a reality that did not exist outside of his control. I took a slow breath, feeling the air fill my lungs in a way that steadied me just enough to move forward, because standing still was no longer an option. Not here, not now. And as I walked toward the entrance, following him into a space that felt both safe and unfamiliar, I understood something that had been building quietly since the moment I stepped into that car. I was not just being protected, I was being placed, positioned in a world where every movement had meaning. And whether I was ready for that or not did not change the fact that I was already part of it. The doors opened before we reached them. Not dramatically, not loudly, just smoothly, like everything here was designed to anticipate rather than react. And as I stepped inside, I felt it immediately. The difference in the air, the quiet that was not empty but controlled, intentional, the kind of silence that held weight instead of absence. The space around me was larger than I expected, but not overwhelming. Everything placed with purpose, every detail precise in a way that made my own life feel scattered by comparison. I slowed without realizing it, my eyes taking in the subtle things, the polished floors, the soft lighting, the absence of anything unnecessary, and I understood then that this was not just a place. It was an extension of him, of the way he moved through the world, measured, deliberate, nothing left to chance. Adrian did not stop walking, but he did not leave me behind either. His pace adjusted just enough to keep me beside him, and that small detail settled into me more than anything else, because it was not something he had to do. It was something he chose to do without acknowledging it. We moved through the space in silence, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like something waiting, like the next part of this had not yet been spoken, but was already understood. A few people passed us at a distance, their movements quiet, respectful, their attention never lingering too long, and I felt it again, that awareness of being seen without being questioned, like my presence here had already been accounted for, like I was expected even if I did not understand why. "You will have a room here," Adrian said finally, his voice low but clear, breaking the silence in a way that did not disrupt it, just shaped it. I nodded slowly, because there was nothing else to do, no reason to argue something that had already been decided. And as we turned down another hallway, I realized I was no longer trying to understand everything at once. I was adjusting, step by step, to the reality in front of me. The room he stopped at was simple compared to the rest, not empty, not cold, just prepared, like it had been waiting for someone to arrive. And that realization sent a quiet ripple through me, because it meant this was not as sudden as it felt, not entirely. Something about this had been anticipated before I even knew I was part of it. Adrian opened the door and stepped aside slightly, not in a formal gesture, but enough to make it clear this space was mine now, at least in the way his world defined ownership. I hesitated at the threshold for just a second, not because I wanted to turn back, but because I understood what crossing it meant. Another step forward, another layer of distance from everything I had known, but I stepped inside anyway, because that had become a pattern now, not retreating, not pausing long enough to reconsider, just moving forward into whatever this was becoming. The room felt quiet, contained, safe in a way that was different from my apartment. Not fragile safety, not temporary, but structured, enforced, and I set my bag down slowly, the simple act grounding me for a moment. When I turned back, Adrian was still there, watching, not with intensity, not with pressure, just present, like he was making sure I understood something without saying it out loud. "You are safe here," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that made me pause. Because safety in his world was not the same as safety in mine. It came with conditions, with boundaries, with expectations that had not yet been spoken. I held his gaze for a second, feeling that truth settle into me. And then I asked the question that had been building quietly beneath everything else, the one thing I had not fully understood yet. "And what does that cost?" I said, my voice steady but softer now. And for the first time since we arrived, Adrian did not answer immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to make me realize that whatever the answer was, it mattered more than anything else he had said so far. And as he finally took a slow step closer, his gaze fixed on mine in a way that made everything else fade for just a second, I understood something before he even spoke. Safety here was not free, and whatever it required from me, it would change more than just where I lived. It would change who I became inside it. The silence after my question did not feel empty. It felt like something being weighed, something measured carefully, before it was given to me, and I held his gaze without looking away this time, because I understood that whatever he said next would define everything that followed. Adrian stepped closer, not invading, not overwhelming, just enough to make the space between us intentional, like every inch had meaning. "It costs certainty," he said finally, his voice low, steady, and the answer was not what I expected, not something tangible, not something I could hold or resist. "Certainty," I repeated softly, trying to understand how something so abstract could feel so heavy. He nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "The life you knew, the rules you trusted, the way you believed the world worked," he continued, each word deliberate. "Those do not exist the same way here." And I felt that settle into me, in a way that made everything else sharpen. Because he was not asking me to give something up, he was telling me it had already changed, that I had already crossed that line without realizing it. I thought about the moment in the rain, about the choice that had felt so simple then, and I saw it differently now, not as a single act, but as the beginning of something that had been unfolding ever since. "And what do I get in return?" I asked, not because I expected something easy, but because I needed to understand the balance of it. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not softer, but clearer, like this part mattered more than the rest. "You get truth," he said, and the words landed differently, not comforting, not reassuring, but honest in a way that left no room for illusion. "You get to see the world as it is, not as you hoped it would be," he added. And I realized then that this was his version of fairness, not protection without cost, not safety without change, but something equal, something that demanded as much as it gave. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of it settle into me fully for the first time, not resisting it, not questioning it anymore, just accepting it for what it was. And something inside me shifted again, not breaking, not bending, just adjusting, aligning with a reality I had not known before, but now could not ignore. "Then I accept it," I said quietly, and the words felt final in a way that nothing else had, not because they ended something, but because they began something else entirely. Adrian held my gaze for a long second, and then he gave the smallest nod, not approval, Not victory, just acknowledgement, like the decision had been made and there was nothing left to negotiate. Then, "You stay," he said, and this time it did not feel like a condition. It felt like a truth that had already settled into place. And as the silence returned, it felt different again, not heavy, not uncertain, just still, like something had been decided and the world had adjusted around it. I stood there in that room that was no longer unfamiliar but not yet mine. And I understood something that stayed with me even as everything else shifted. I had not lost myself in this. Not yet. I had brought something with me, something that had changed the course of all of this simply by existing. And whether that would be enough to hold on to who I was or reshape who I became was something I would only understand with time. But one thing was clear. I had chosen this, not the danger, not the uncertainty, but the truth, and whatever came with it. I would face it as the person who had stopped in the rain when it would have been easier to walk away. And maybe that was the point, not that kindness was safe, but that it was powerful enough to change the direction of things that seemed unmovable. And if there was anything to take from this, it was that the smallest choices we make, the quiet ones, the ones no one else sees, can shape entire worlds in ways we never expect. So choose them carefully, choose them honestly, and when the moment comes, do not look away from who you are, because that is the one thing no world, no matter how controlled, should ever be allowed to take from you.